Well, thank you, Holly, for these beautiful remarks, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second day of the Summit on Modern Conflicts and Emerging Threats. What a great day we had yesterday. General Todd Walters launched our conversation with from-the-ground insights on the start of the war in Ukraine and high-level framing of some of the strategic complexities as we're thinking about a new phase in global security. And he framed it as a competition over values. Our morning panels included digging into the security challenges related to Russia and China, the emerging strategic complexities, and how domestic politics, including in Russia, would play into the national security context. David Marlow gave us a rare look into how the CIA's intelligence gathering operations are evolving to address current threats, and he did it with both insight and a sense of humor. And we spent the afternoon immersed in the urgent topics of misinformation, disinformation, cybersecurity, with Major General Lorna Maylock wrapping up the themes together in her closing keynote. Today, as you've heard, that discussion will be steered by our summit moderator, Dr. Holly Tucker, director of the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. And you already saw some idea and some sense of how bringing different points of view can really help us to understand how conflicts emerge and how they change. And so I'm particularly looking forward to today's keynotes. First, we're going to have the National Security Agency Director of Research, Gil Herrera, who will talk exactly about this topic, about how research can contribute our sense of national security. And then I'm thrilled to welcome back General Paul Nakasone, who has graciously returned to Vanderbilt after highlighting last year's gathering to give us our closing talk. Overall, we could not be more pleased with our second summit on modern conflicts and emerging threats. I think it really has become a wonderful place where people come together in a trusted environment and can talk about the real issues candidly and from their own perspective. But as I said yesterday, we're proud, but we're not satisfied. So we want to ask ourselves, what can we do more? What can we do more as a community? And what can we do more right here at Vanderbilt? In our panel on educational needs yesterday, you saw the urgent demand to develop talent for this new type of conflicts. And we are all over this, whether it is to our undergraduate programs and also as we're thinking about new offerings, whether it's certificates or master's programs. But today, I want to spend a little time to talk about the role of research, and especially the role that research universities can play in this area. For, as you just heard, much more eloquently than I will be able to talk about it, the study of war and conflict has been an academic enterprise since the dawn of humanity. Indeed, academic research and conflict are deeply intertwined. History as a discipline, if you think about it, really started as a history of war. We look back all the way to Herodotus and Thucydides. And today, Thucydides' insights on the Peloponnesian War are as important and as insightful as they were almost 2,500 years ago, with the rising power of Athens being replaced by the rising power of China. And the same strategic complexity and challenges are still in front of us. All war strategists still read Sun Tzu and Clausewitz. And one of Clausewitz's great insights, of course, was the main weakness of an alliance is that they need to stick together, which is exactly the problem, or one of the strategic problems we're facing right now when we think about the Western coalition and their support for Ukraine. And General Walters talked about it yesterday as one of the three principles is that maintaining the glue of NATO was one of the core aims of NATO strategy. And of course, medicine, physics, and the natural sciences have always been at the core of military innovation, and I'm sure we hear more of that today. Archimedes not only was hanging out in a bathtub, but created huge catapults. Galileo developed a military compass, and Leonardo da Vinci was not only a skilled battleman engineer, but invented futuristic machines that we now recognize as precursors of tanks, submarines, and machine guns. And of course, in modern times, the Manhattan Project relied on the insights of the crème de la crème of the leading physicists of their time. Giants of the fields such as Fermi, Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, all refugees from the Nazis or Italian fascists, by the way, under the leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Gross, made an enormous contribution to national security, really unparalleled, I think, in history. But importantly, that project and how it was organized not only had profound impacts for the course of World War II, but it changed the history of science and the history of research. Because the example of leading minds working together on an urgent task became the model not only for the national laboratories that are now a huge important part and pillar of the American research enterprise, but also the successful model of competitive research funding through the Vanderbilt Bush and the Endless Frontier. But new conflicts need new ideas. And whenever we see a new type of conflict emerging, so far at least, research has stepped up and has made an important contribution to that. Nowhere more than when we look back at the emergence of nuclear conflict as a real possibility. The prospect of nuclear war led indeed to the birth of modern game theory, which is my home discipline, which is really the mathematics of conflict and cooperation, originally developed by John von Neumann, another emigre, and Oscar Morgenstern, another emigre, and all, again, refugees from the Nazi occupation of Europe, who really developed the fundamental mathematics of how we think about conflict, and many of the terms that we now use on a day-to-day basis, like zero-sum games, were invented by them. But much of what they were doing in the mid-40s was driven by the urgent need to understand the complexities of nuclear strategy. And one of the first and probably most well-known insights that came out of that is the well-known prisoner's dilemma, where we have two prisoners, should they accuse each other or not, which became, of course, a key metaphor for armed conflict and arms races, because it has the horrible property for the prisoners is that there's a strong incentive individually to inform on the other side, even though collectively both would be better off if they kept their mouth shut. This little game was invented by Meryl Flood and Melvin Dreschel at the Rand Foundation, which was one of the intellectual centers of the new way of thinking. And I think it's really difficult to think about the development of nuclear strategy without the development of game theory, and then to think about the development of game theory without the threats and urgent need of nuclear strategy. So it's a beautiful example about how these two, the need, the urgent policy need, and the capability and capacity of research to step up really reinformed each other. A little later, Thomas Schelling, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, introduced the so-called chicken game, another way to think about conflict. And it's illustrated, if you have a little time over the weekend, by the movie Rebel Without a Cause, one of the famous James Dean movies. And you may, with those of you who have seen it, you may remember a scene when these two teenagers kind of race in cars against each other, and whoever swerves first is a chicken. So you immediately can see how we can think about conflicts and standoffs in the same way. Now, Schelling disturbingly showed that this game has three outcomes, or three equilibria. Outcome one, the first car swerves and the second car drives on. Second option is the first car drives on, the second car swerves. Third option, they both flip a coin. That's not a good outcome, usually. But it shows that in these types of situations where there is a standoff and where the tougher side basically is the winner, you can have inadvertently, even though everybody is rational, conflicts. Schelling famously showed that in this type of conflict, it is rational to commit in ex ante. So the best strategy, if you ever find yourself in Rebel Without a Cause, is to take your steering wheel and throw it out of the window. Okay, that's the rational choice, or to appear crazy. Okay, so Schelling showed that it's rational to be irrational when we have strategic situations like that. And this creates all sorts of kind of complex, interesting issues, but that really baffling us all the way down, I would say, how we thought about the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the Second Iraq War. The post-9/11 conflicts brought the introduction of yet another way of thinking into thinking about modern conflicts, a very different type of conflicts. Now we don't have two blocks or two security blocks and military alliances at a standoff, and we're trying to think through what are they thinking, what am I thinking. Now we had sub-state conflict, the question of collapsing states, terrorism, insurgencies, civil wars, and violence, in large part because state order was collapsing. That brought the introduction of economics and sophisticated statistical models, not used in the understanding of conflict before until this point in time. And here's one example. Many people in the policy community had argued that civil war and terrorism, and actually even violent gangs, are the cause of poverty. So the idea was, well, if you invest in development, for example, give financial aid or work on state building, that would reduce conflict. But as always, on closer inspection, things are a little bit more complicated. Note first that to figure out whether this theory is true, we cannot run a controlled experiment. We can't just take two countries, impoverish one of them, and then see whether conflict goes up. Okay, so our institutional review boards at the university would say, we're not doing that one. Okay, so that's not possible, but we want to know whether it's true, and we want to go beyond just looking case studies. And so this is where the economists come in. And what they have been doing in totally different areas, they have developed very sophisticated statistical models that basically exploit naturally occurring variation and random events that are correlated with the outcomes we're interested in, and then investigate whether the claim holds. And that is the modern discipline of econometrics. So here's one example of this. There are two competing theories of how economic development affects violence. One states that civil wars, gang violence, and terrorism really work like labor markets. And this tells you why economics is known as the dismal science, okay? So bear with me. So the idea is basically, if you have particularly young men that have no other job opportunities, joining a gang or a terrorist organization or an insurgency is a career. And so looking at the relative opportunities for these, but usually young men, some young women as well, understanding that is critical. So if there are no other opportunities, you're going to choose a path of violence because that's rational and that maximizes your long-term payoff. Again, economics, the dismal science. So the argument goes, economic development should reduce violence because now there are more attractive job openings than joining the path of violence. That's the logic. But another claim, another interpretation said, no, be careful. Because economic development can also increase violence because with greater wealth, there's more to fight about. So which one is right? And there's a beautiful paper by Andrella Dubé, a faculty member at my old employer, the Harvard School of Public Policy, University of Chicago, and I'm proud to say I recruited her there, who basically settled this debate. And here's what she did. She looked at Colombia during the Civil War, where the country had effectively, I'm oversimplifying here, I know there are people who know a lot about this, had two legitimate industries in addition to coca production, which was the third. One was oil, the other was coffee. Oil is capital intensive, and what rebels basically can do is they can steal oil by going after pipelines. So the higher the price of oil, the more valuable it is to take a chance to try to steal oil and then sell it. Coffee is labor intensive. So there, right, the higher the price of coffee, the more valuable it is to work on a coffee plantation. So she then, this is the clever part, looked in the variation of global commodity prices for oil and coffee. That's the external randomization that nobody can control in this particular case. And here's what she finds. As the price of oil goes up, violence goes up in oil-producing regions because there's more to steal and it's more valuable, but not in other parts of the country. And as the price of coffee goes up, violence goes up in coffee-producing regions because now the insurgents, as the price of coffee goes up, violence goes down because joining the insurgents now becomes less attractive. Okay? Now, that kind of has important, non-obvious policy consequences, I would argue. The first one is, if you invest in developmental aid and state building, make sure you're not investing in capital projects that can easily be stolen. Okay? Because that just increases violence. Moreover, if you invest in education, that investment in education must be matched by job opportunities. Because if not, all you're doing is you create a better educated and thus more productive generation of fighters or terrorists that can't find jobs in the civilian sector. So that's what economics can help, and that's what econometrics can do. It can help us tease out these different factors and then see how they directly translate into policy outcomes. By the way, these insights, of course, both from game theory and from modern economics and econometrics, are as important today as they were when they were invented. We yesterday heard on one of the panels that China's investment in improving its nuclear capacity now moves nuclear conflict effectively, or has the danger of moving nuclear conflict from a bilateral to a trilateral conflict. That is not what we have been thinking about. The models in game theory always look at two actors against each other, but now once you have a third one, the whole thing becomes more complicated for the obvious reasons that if two go to war, the third one is the winner. So that changes already the dynamics of the whole thing. We haven't thought this out through at all. And then, of course, the emergence of Taliban and ISIS is painful evidence that the interconnection between political and economic development and violence cannot be ignored. And of course, we have the same problems now at our southern border related to drug-related violence in Mexico and Central America and all the kind of migration and refugee problems that come with that. But as if this wasn't challenging enough, we now have profoundly new challenges. And this is where academia has to step up. The key challenge, the key research challenge for us in universities, in my view, is that we're now living in a networked economy that creates new forms of conflict in addition to the old ones. We already extensively discussed this yesterday and will continue today, but I think it's worthwhile to probe a little bit deeper. The first is the challenge of cybersecurity. Now, so far, this has mostly been studied and conceptualized as an engineering problem. And doing this as an engineering problem is hugely important, and Vanderbilt, of course, is one of the leaders in this area. But adding some insights from game theory can be tremendously helpful. We saw this actually last year in a riveting panel on the attribution problem, meaning that in contrast to a nuclear attack where we know who fired a missile, the same is not necessarily true of cyber attacks because we may not be able where it was launched from. But then if we don't know who launched a cyber attack, how do we think of concepts such as retaliation, escalation, or flexible response? But Vanderbilt also has a terrific group of political scientists well-versed in game theory and econometrics, and having them collaborate with our computer scientists to think about cybersecurity at that level could yield great benefits. The second are global supply chains and financial networks. The scale of sanctions against Russia was unprecedented, and it crucially involved the private sector at a massive scale that we have never seen before. Just one example, of course, was the unprecedented cutting off of the Russian banks from SWIFT. Similarly, supply chain issues loom large whenever we think about China and Taiwan. Business schools, including our own school, have extensive expertise, including sophisticated mathematical models on supply chains and financial networks. But when they think about these networks and how to design them, they're not thinking in the context of national security, they're thinking in the context of efficiency and resilience. They're not thinking about their defensive or even offensive capabilities. I doubt there's a single business school in the United States who has thought about this until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I doubt they're thinking hard about it now. But there's a treasure trove of sophisticated knowledge that can play a hugely important role in this new form of conflict. And again, strategic issues are front and center. Once the West cuts Rust or Russia off SWIFT, other countries naturally think about alternatives to the US dollar and the US-controlled financial system. And then how should the US and their allies respond to that instead? And finally, we all witnessed a gripping panel on misinformation yesterday. Analyzing this threat in detail will require the contribution of computer scientists together with game theorists in other areas. For example, how should we think about the arms race between large language models that now can generate misinformation at scale and software that can detect whether a post was generated by a chatbot? And then there's the huge potential contribution by social and political psychologists who study in detail which messages work and why and how they shape public opinion. These are profoundly important and profoundly difficult questions, and this is crucially important. They will require unprecedented collaboration between disciplines who have never collaborated in the past. Supply chain experts and defense strategists, political psychologists, and AI researchers. At Vanderbilt, we are committed to figuring this out. Our track record in working across boundaries and disciplines speaks to that. And our culture of radical cooperation is uniquely suited in getting this right. And we need to get it right. But for this to work and for this to be really productive and effective, we need to be in deep conversation with policymakers and security leaders like you. We need to understand what the real challenges are and test what works. We're already doing this with exoskeleton and redesign hammers for the 101st Airborne and our partnership with Fort Campbell. And we're doing it in our cybersecurity labs. But we need to do it when confronting new challenges that bring different points of view together, and we need to be able to do it at scale. This summit shows how it can be done. But now it's time to make that promise a reality. We commit that over the summer, here at Vanderbilt, we will take the first steps to figuring this out. The stakes could not be higher. So I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for your partnership, and I want to thank you for your service. Thank you very much.